Manny Ramirez, once the pure embodiment of greatness in American baseball, a hitter whose mere presence in the batter's box could silence an entire stadium waiting for a historic moment. The owner of a swing that was smooth yet ruthless, blending street instinct with elite Major League Baseball class. During his peak career, Manny hit 555 home runs, posted a .312 batting average, drove in 1,831 RBI, earned 12 All-Star selections, 9 Silver Sluggers, and most importantly, played a decisive role in 2 Boston Red Sox World Series championships, including the 2004 World Series MVP, where he became the symbol of a city's historic liberation after nearly a century of waiting. With Cleveland, he was the centerpiece of one of the most feared lineups of the 1990s. With Boston, he was the destruction machine that broke the curse for the team. To all of MLB, Manny was proof that some talents rise above systems, strategies, or coaching molds. His numbers weren't just impressive, they were iconic, enough to place Manny Ramirez alongside the greatest hitters of all time, a genius whom baseball history once bowed to acknowledge. But it was from that very peak that Manny's pain began to show clearly, because fame didn't bring him belonging, it only amplified the loneliness that had followed him since his poor immigrant childhood. As the lights grew brighter, Manny retreated deeper into silence, framed by oversimplified labels, misunderstood as indifferent or lazy, when in reality he was a man who didn't know how to protect himself from the brutal pressure and expectations of American baseball. His mistakes, especially the PEDs, didn't just damage his legacy, they pushed him out of the arms of official history, leaving a man now in his 53rd year with a great career but an unfinished place in it. Yet Manny didn't collapse, didn't resent, didn't beg for forgiveness. He chose to endure quietly, returning to family, to his son, to small fields where the cheers are gone, but the ball still rolls and the familiar rhythm remains. Manny's will isn't about being honored again, it's about continuing to live, continuing to love baseball in the most humble way, accepting both the glory and the cracks, like a man who's walked a brutal journey and still stands firm, whether history turns its back or not. If you want to understand what really happened behind this genius who once made all of MLB hold its breath, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next part of the story. Manny Ramirez wasn't born to cheers, nor did he enter this world with prophecies of glory or coaches ready to shape every movement. He was born in the silence of the poor alleys of the Dominican Republic, where baseball wasn't a recreational sport, but the only lifeline for kids with nothing but their hands and fragile dreams. From a very young age, Manny held a bat with a strange instinct, a smooth, seamless swing that needed no correction, no explanation, as if his body knew what to do before his mind could catch up, a gift that left the adults around him both amazed and confused, because they saw the talent but didn't know how to protect it. Manny hit before he could express thoughts, reacted before he learned language, and that later became the paradox that followed him his whole life. A man who could speak fluently with a bat but felt lost when using words to explain himself. Manny's childhood was tied to deprivation, to scorching afternoons on dusty dirt fields where every hit wasn't just play, it was a silent prayer for a different future, one without poverty, without limits, without doors slammed shut because of where he came from. But it was in that very environment, with no real teachers, no structured training system, that Manny's talent grew wild, free and fragile, like a bright flame burning in the wind with no one to build a shield around it. When he left the Dominican Republic to enter professional baseball, Manny carried that raw gift with him, but he carried no tools to protect himself from the misunderstandings, prejudices and pressures of a harsh American baseball world that demanded not just results but behavior, not just performance but the ability to fit in. Manny was never taught how to tell the world he was tired, confused, or why everything felt so complicated, and so he chose silence, a silence born not from arrogance, but from helplessness. Talent came to Manny too early, faster than anyone could prepare him with mental armor, and when the world began seeing the home runs, the hits that made entire stadiums explode, they didn't see the still lost child inside, the child who never had anyone stand beside him to explain, to guide, to say that talent also needed care like a fragile life. In American baseball, they celebrate geniuses who speak, who lead, who control their image. Manny was different. He existed on pure instinct, on an almost primal connection to the ball, and that very purity, in a world full of rules and expectations, became his fatal weakness. From the early days, Manny was seen as something elusive, hard to understand, and since no one would act as his interpreter, the world chose to label, to simplify, turning silence into indifference, turning difference into a problem. Manny's tragedy didn't begin with later mistakes, didn't start with fame or scandal. It began much earlier, the moment a genius was born in silence, raised by poverty, and handed to the whole world without anyone teaching him how to exist in it. When Manny Ramirez left the Dominican Republic and set foot in New York, he didn't step into the promised land like the fairy tale immigrant stories tell. He stepped into Washington Heights, a crowded, noisy neighborhood where Dominican families squeezed together amid survival and uncertainty, where the American dream was always present but rarely within reach. There, Manny wasn't a special kid. He was just a child who spoke broken English, quietly watching the world around him, with the cautious eyes of someone always afraid of saying the wrong thing, misunderstanding, or not being heard. School wasn't where Manny found recognition. Friends weren't where he found his voice. The surrounding society didn't give him a sense of belonging. Only the baseball field, with its smell of dirt, the crack of bat on ball, and the familiar rhythm of pitches, was a place that asked no questions, demanded no explanations, required him to be no one other than himself. On the field, Manny didn't need to speak. His swing said it all. Off the field, he quickly realized silence was safer than speaking up. That shrinking inward felt easier than trying to fit into a world that always saw him as an outsider. With no close friends to share his fears, no adults patient enough to hear his young confusion, Manny learned to survive by narrowing his world, turning his talent into his only refuge, a place where he wasn't judged by his voice, his background, or his awkwardness in communication. Baseball became Manny's private language, a language needing no translation, no editing, where every hit was a complete, clear, undeniable statement. But the price of that choice was a loneliness rooted deep, a quiet kind that accumulated silently, making Manny grow up feeling the world outside the field was always strange and hard to understand. In Washington Heights, amid streets full of sound and color, Manny lived in an ever-narrowing mental space, where he rarely dared reveal his thoughts or express his feelings, because every time he tried stepping outside the safety of his talent, he faced being ignored or misunderstood. Baseball accepted Manny for what he could do, not for who he was, and that was both his salvation and a warning he couldn't yet see. While other kids learned to build friendships, argue, defend themselves with words, Manny learned silence, learned to hide inside his own talent, treating every practice and game like a shelter from the vast world spinning around without waiting for him to catch up. It was during those immigrant years that the feeling of not belonging became part of his identity, not because Manny wasn't good enough, but because he was never given the tools needed to exist beyond the field, to tell the world that behind those perfect hits was a child always afraid of being abandoned. And from there, Manny's tragedy began to take shape very early. A man only seen when holding a bat, gradually believing that without baseball, he would have no other place to be accepted. When Manny Ramirez was called in the MLB draft at a high position, that moment wasn't like a reward for a journey of growth. It was like a huge door suddenly opening in front of someone never prepared to step into the spotlight. A high draft pick meant high expectations, and in the American professional baseball system, expectations came without patience. The Cleveland Indians saw in Manny the numbers, the swings, the balls that could change games, but they didn't try to understand the person behind the bat. The system didn't ask where Manny came from, what he'd been through, what he feared. It only asked how many home runs he could hit, how many wins he could bring, how much value he could create. To Cleveland, Manny was an asset to exploit, not a person to guide. And Manny, already accustomed to silence from his immigrant years, stepped into MLB like a child, pushed straight onto a big stage with no one showing him how to stand steady under blinding lights. No one taught him how to face the media, how to explain his differences, or how to protect himself from the hasty labels of a sport that always needs simple stories. Manny was told to be professional, but no one defined professional for him beyond continuing to hit well. The first problems appeared quickly, and instead of being seen as signals needing support, they became evidence for the system to judge. Manny was called distracted because he often left games mentally, not from lack of responsibility, but because he didn't know how to stay focused in a constantly pressuring environment. His defense was scrutinized. Every slow step, every imperfect play was magnified, as if a hitting genius had no right to flaws in any area. Above all, Manny didn't communicate the way MLB expected. He didn't stand at microphones to explain himself, didn't argue with coaches, didn't join long tactical talks in the clubhouse. The silence that once was Manny's refuge was now seen as attitude, as indifference, as something to fix. Cleveland wanted quick results, wanted to win right away, and in that process, they had no time to learn how to listen to a different person. Manny was forced into the mold of a cold system, where anyone who didn't fit would be reshaped, and if they couldn't be reshaped, they'd be seen as trouble. Instead of being protected, Manny was thrust before the public as a paradox, both the biggest hope and the most irritating question mark. Every success brought applause from the system, every offbeat moment brought turned backs. No one stood beside him to say where that distraction came from, that the silence was the result of a long journey of being left alone. That imperfect defense didn't mean lack of commitment. Manny walked through MLB with enough talent to survive, but with no map to guide him, and in the bright lights of the world's toughest league, he gradually learned a painful truth. Being drafted didn't mean being understood, and when the system only cared about results, people like Manny had to learn to endure in silence, even as the first cracks began to form. Those years in Cleveland for Manny Ramirez were a period where the outside world saw glory, while inside there was only prolonged loneliness without explanation. On the field, Manny hit like a survival instinct, not the kind of effort honed by drills or collective motivation, but the reflex of a man who'd long been used to saving himself from a very early age. Every swing he took carried the urgency of someone who knew that if he didn't create something right then and there, the world would quickly turn its back. And he created a lot: home runs soaring over the fences, hits that left opponents helpless, moments when the entire Cleveland stadium rose in roaring waves. Fans loved Manny because he delivered wins, because he made baseball come alive, because every time he stepped into the batter's box it was an unspoken promise that something special was about to happen. But when the cheers faded, when the stadium lights dimmed and the clubhouse door closed, Manny stepped into a completely different space, where silence wasn't a moment of rest, it was the constant state. In that clubhouse, Manny wasn't the center of jokes, wasn't the team's spiritual leader, wasn't the voice sought out when the team needed bonding. He sat there, quietly, existing among teammates but not truly belonging, as if an invisible wall separated him from the rest of the group. No one really knew who Manny was beyond the numbers on the stat sheet. No one understood what he was thinking as he quietly changed his shoes. No one asked what he carried inside after every game. Cleveland had a superstar, but not a person who was listened to. And it was in that disconnect that Manny's tragedy slowly became clear. Success didn't reduce loneliness, it only made the loneliness harder to see for those benefiting from his talent. Manny shone alone, not because he wanted to, but because that was the only way he knew how to survive in a system that always demanded results, but rarely paused to ask what the price of those results was. When the team won, Manny got applause. When the team lost, the familiar issues were dragged out and dissected, as if he always stood on a fragile line between genius and burden. The whispers in the clubhouse, the puzzled looks, the conversations Manny didn't join, all of it reinforced the feeling that no matter how well he hit, he was still an outsider in his own team. Baseball, the only language Manny spoke fluently, kept him steady on the field, but it couldn't help him connect off it. And as the Cleveland Stadium lights illuminated his glory, they also exposed the bitter truth that some people are loved for what they can do but not understood for who they are. Manny in those years became the symbol of that painful paradox, an irreplaceable star professionally, yet an individual no one truly stepped toward to understand. He hit to live, to survive, to prove he deserved to be there, but each swing unintentionally deepened the gap between him and the world around him. Cleveland gave Manny a stage to shine, but not a place to belong, and in that brilliant spotlight, Manny's loneliness didn't vanish, it just learned to hide behind applause that never lasted long enough to warm a man who'd grown up used to silence. When Manny Ramirez stepped from rising star to Cleveland icon, fame didn't arrive like an embracing hug, it arrived like a spotlight aimed straight at his every smallest movement. From that moment, Manny was no longer just an outstanding hitter, he became a figure who needed explaining, labeling, simplifying to fit the stories American media loved to tell, and in that world, difference was rarely patiently explored, it was usually turned into a problem. Manny, with his ingrained silence, with his existence out of step from the American star mold, was quickly framed with short, cutting words: lazy, uninterested, difficult. Those labels repeated so often they gradually became a verdict without trial, a story told in place of the real person, without anyone bothering to verify. The media didn't ask what Manny was thinking, didn't question his immigrant journey, the language barriers, an inner world long accustomed to retreating into silence for self-defense. They only saw moments when Manny didn't fit the expected image, and used them as proof for a predetermined conclusion. Every headline, every commentary segment, every morning sports show was like a small cut, not deep enough to kill his career instantly, but steady enough to wound a man who never had mental armor. Manny didn't fight back, didn't stand up to argue, didn't try to tell his own story to the public, because he'd never been taught that was necessary to survive in the lights. The silence that once was a safe refuge was now seen as proof of indifference, and Manny became a figure stared at but not heard. Fame turned into surveillance, where every action was examined under a microscope, every small deviation magnified into character, while quiet efforts weren't flashy enough for the front page. Manny stepped onto the field every day carrying not just the burden of performance, but of having to prove he cared in the way others defined it, a near impossible task for someone never good at expressing emotion through words. He still hit brilliantly, even more fearfully so, but that didn't soften the story around him. Instead, it made the paradox more bitter. How could someone be so great and yet be seen as lacking commitment? American media, in their search for easy-to-tell characters, overlooked Manny's complexity, overlooked the possibility that some people love the game in very different ways, love it in silence, in the persistent repetition of swings that need no explanation. Manny stayed silent, not because he agreed with what was said about him, but because he didn't know where to start to rewrite a story that had been told for too long without him in it. Day after day, the small cuts accumulated, not bleeding outwardly, but leaving invisible scars, making Manny withdraw even deeper into the only world where he felt safe, the world of flying balls and wooden bats meeting the sweet spot. Fame, what so many dream of, became for Manny a cage made of lights, where he was seen from every angle, but never truly looked into. And in that relentless scrutiny, Manny gradually understood a painful truth: sometimes being seen too much without being understood is lonelier than never being seen at all from the start. When Manny Ramirez signed the $160 million contract to wear the Boston Red Sox uniform, it wasn't just a historic money deal, it was the moment a man stepped straight into the harshest pressure cooker in American baseball. Boston wasn't like Cleveland. If Cleveland accepted Manny for his hits, Boston demanded far more. They demanded an icon, a voice, an attitude that reflected the spirit of a city that lived on memory, pain, and the longing for redemption. And in that context, Manny became the greatest hope, the one expected to deliver what the entire city had waited nearly a century for. He did it. The World Series arrived, the curse crumbled, autumn nights exploded with endless cheers, and Manny became the hero in a historic moment every Boston kid would hear about. The city honored him, jerseys with his name flooded the stands, and every Manny swing was seen as proof that every sacrifice was worth it. But behind that honor was a cold truth. Money couldn't buy peace and glory couldn't shield a different kind of person. Boston loved Manny for what he brought, but Boston was also a place that didn't forgive deviation, wasn't patient with silence, didn't accept a star who wouldn't tell the story the way they wanted. Here Manny wasn't just watched, he was scrutinized with an intensity he'd never known. Every tiniest behavior analyzed, every distracted moment blamed, every choice of silence interpreted as disrespect. Manny, already used to shrinking from the lights, was now forced to live in a space where silence was a sin. Relentless questions from the media, unforgiving comments from fans, expectations that never stopped rising, made Manny gradually feel that no matter how well he hit, he still couldn't meet the invisible thing Boston demanded, fitting in according to the mold. This city didn't just want wins, they wanted remorse, passion expressed in words, constant presence in public conversations. Manny didn't have those things. He had talent, he had results, but he had no language to defend himself in an environment that didn't allow difference. And when he couldn't meet it, Manny began doing the only thing he knew to survive: isolating himself. He narrowed his world, avoided unnecessary conversations, withdrew from spaces where he always felt he had to explain what he'd never learned to express. In a noisy, emotional city like Boston, that withdrawal was even more misunderstood, even more taken as proof of the old labels the media had already stuck on him. Instead of being protected by his performance, Manny was trapped between two extremes: hero on the field and suspect off it. As each game passed, each season piled on the last, the pressure didn't ease, it just changed shape, from expectation to surveillance, from honor to endless demands. Manny carried on his shoulders not just the money from the historic contract, but the weight of a city that had suffered too long to allow any difference to derail their redemption story. And in that suffocating atmosphere, Manny gradually understood that even though he'd brought home the trophy Boston craved, he still hadn't found a place to breathe, because some cities love you with everything when you win, but don't know how to love a person when that person needs peace. After Boston, when the pressure had reached a suffocating level, Manny Ramirez was no longer seen as a complex human being, but reduced to a catchy, laughable, easily spread phrase: Manny being Manny. Just those 4 words, seemingly harmless, did what thousands of serious analyses couldn't. They stripped Manny of his full humanity. From the moment that phrase appeared, every one of Manny's actions was ripped from its context, turned into entertainment snippets, presented as proof of an eccentric nature to be mocked rather than understood. A play where he didn't run full speed, a moment where he admired a fly ball, a time he left the field earlier than expected, all bundled under the same label, as if those 4 words were enough to explain everything. The media no longer needed to ask why Manny did it, they just repeated the phrase, and the audience laughed, nodded, accepted. In the process, Manny was gradually turned into a meme before social media truly dominated, an image endlessly reused, losing depth, losing context, and eventually losing the right to be seen as a suffering human being. No one asked Manny if he was tired after long seasons, after piled-on pressures, after constantly having to prove he was worth every dollar in that historic contract. No one asked if he was in pain, physically or mentally, when every small deviation was blown up into public comedy. Instead, people laughed, because there was a ready-made template for laughing, a phrase short enough to cover the complexity they didn't want to face. Manny being Manny became a shield between the real man and the world, allowing everyone to see Manny without ever having to understand him. In that spotlight, Manny was no longer allowed moments of weakness, no longer allowed to be tired, no longer allowed to be a man who had gone too far, too long in a system that was never gentle. His identity was peeled layer by layer, from hitting genius to comic figure, from victory-bringing star to subject of mocking highlight reels. And Manny, already accustomed to silence, had no tools to reclaim his story. He could only watch his identity be taken away, not knowing where to begin to fight back. Every time that phrase was repeated, it carved the gap deeper between Manny and himself, between what he felt inside and what the world decided to see. Once standardized, a joke becomes the hardest thing to break, because it lets people avoid the responsibility of understanding. And in that laughter, Manny's tragedy didn't explode loudly, it quietly spread, as one man was slowly erased from his own story, replaced by a convenient label, until when the lights went out, no one remembered that behind those words was once a man who knew pain, knew exhaustion, and only ever wanted to be seen as himself, not as an endless repeating punchline. Stepping out from the lights of headlines and mockery, Manny Ramirez returned to what should have been a professional athlete's second home, the clubhouse. But for Manny, It never was a place of belonging. There, he wasn't a leader, nor was he expected to become the voice that rallied the group. He simply existed as a lone individual carrying talent too big, but mismatched with the collective rhythm. MLB clubhouses run on unspoken rules, constant communication, jokes to release pressure, long tactical talks to build a sense of we. Manny didn't step into those circles. He sat in his familiar corner, changing shoes, preparing bats, so quiet that others sometimes forgot he was there, until the game started, and every eye turned to him again. That quiet wasn't disdain. It was the self-protective habit of a man who'd learned to survive by not taking up too much of others' mental space. But in a group that sees communication as a sign of commitment, silence quickly became distance. Manny wasn't a leader because he was never given that role, and also because he didn't know how to express care in familiar patterns. He wasn't a voice, because every time he needed to speak, he felt like he was speaking a language no one really wanted to hear. Relationships with coaches grew tense over time, not because Manny rebelled, but because he didn't respond the way they expected. Tactical meetings, reminders about defense, effort, image, all passed through Manny like orders without emotional instructions. He listened, nodded, then returned to the only thing he trusted, his hitting ability. That lack of connection pushed Manny further outside important discussions, as if he only needed to show up when the game began and disappear when people needed to talk. In a team, not belonging can hurt more than being excluded, because it creates a floating feeling, not fully in but not fully out either. Manny showed up every day, contributed with decisive swings, but didn't join the emotional flow of the team. When the team won, he was praised for the results. When the team lost, his silence was seen as irresponsibility. There was no middle ground for a different kind of person. Coaches, under pressure to control the clubhouse, gradually saw Manny as an unmanageable enigma, a genius who wouldn't conform, and that tension simmered on, never exploding but never resolved. Manny didn't argue, didn't debate, didn't fight back. He just stepped back one more pace, the way he'd done since childhood, shrinking into his own space to avoid collision. But the more he shrank, the wider the gap grew, and the clubhouse, what should have been a collective refuge, became a symbol of the collective loneliness Manny couldn't escape. There, he was always out of place, like a puzzle piece that wasn't wrong but didn't fit, always slightly off from the bigger picture. The glances that passed over him, the conversations that paused when he entered, not always from malice, but from accumulated lack of understanding. Manny carried the feeling that he was only truly accepted the instant the ball met the bat. The rest was an emptiness no one wanted to fill, and in that paradox, he kept existing, present but not belonging, contributing but not connected, a man standing in the middle of a group yet still alone, as if that clubhouse never had a spot prepared for a Manny Ramirez. The silence in the clubhouse finally spilled onto the big stage, and the moment Manny Ramirez tested positive for PEDs, every already simplified story suddenly found a convenient conclusion. To the public, it was the missing piece that completed the picture they'd grown used to seeing: an unusual genius, puzzling attitude, distracted moments, and now an undeniable mistake. But the most painful part wasn't the test result itself, it was how the story was instantly framed, so quickly that there was no room left for the human being standing behind it. Manny didn't step to the microphone to defend himself, didn't hold a press conference to explain, didn't offer long explanations about pressure, exhaustion, or choices made in the dark. He chose silence, not as a strategy, but as the familiar reflex of a man who'd grown up in silence and learned to endure rather than argue. In the American sports world, where every mistake demands a public confession or a carefully scripted redemption story, that silence was seen as bare admission. The public only saw guilt, only saw a name tied to PEDs, only saw betrayal of the game they loved. They didn't see the years Manny carried nameless pressure, didn't see a man too used to being looked at without being understood, didn't see the exhaustion built up after thousands of swings under relentless scrutiny. The media didn't need to dig deeper, they had what they needed to tell a tidy story, where Manny became the example of a genius's fall for refusing to conform. And once again, Manny wasn't asked what he was thinking, what he feared, or what he was losing. His silence became the blank space everyone freely filled with their own judgment. In that moment, Manny didn't just lose part of his legacy, he lost the right to be seen as a complex human, with weaknesses and mistakes inseparable from a long journey of loneliness. The mistake, already a burden, was now stripped of context, stripped of depth, stripped of any chance to be understood. Manny accepted the punishment, accepted the criticism, accepted his name being dragged through headlines, but he didn't accept turning his pain into a performance. That choice made him even more distant from a public already used to viewing him through a shallow lens. They wanted loud apologies, tears, a clear redemption arc. Manny only had silence and endurance, and in that disconnect, the tragedy deepened, not because the mistake went unpunished, but because the human behind the mistake was never seen. When the suspension was announced, when Manny's name appeared on every sports broadcast, questions about the man himself were completely overlooked, giving way to quick conclusions. That first silence didn't save Manny, but it exposed a bitter truth in a world that always demands explanations at the right time, and in the right way. Those who don't know how or can't speak up will have their story told for them. Manny walked out of that chapter with a scar not just on his career record, but in how he would be remembered. A scar formed the moment the public saw only guilt, without ever stopping to see the man carrying it. The second PED incident came to Manny Ramirez, not as a sudden shock, but as a cold final stamp on a fate that had been cracked for a long time. If the first time still left room for doubt, for debate, for hope that the story could still take another turn, the second time nearly closed every door in silence. The heavy suspension was announced, the dry words ran across news tickers, and in that very moment, the lights that had illuminated Manny for 2 decades began to dim, not loudly, not with argument, not dramatically. There was only a heavy feeling spreading across the baseball world. This story was essentially over. Manny didn't come out to defend himself, didn't hold a press conference, didn't try to cling to an image slipping from his grasp. He looked straight at reality, where any words at that point felt superfluous, and chose to walk away. Not with a formal announcement, not with a farewell embrace on the field in front of a stadium, but with a quiet decision, almost vanishing from the mainstream flow of MLB. No goodbye to the fans who once rose for him, no final stage for the bat to meet the ball one last time amid familiar cheers. Manny left the way he had lived most of his career, no explanation, no performance, no pleading to be understood. MLB closed the door in silence, and that silence was more terrifying than any condemnation, because it gave Manny no chance to speak, nor the public a chance to reflect more deeply. In that moment, one of the greatest hitters in history wasn't sent off as a legend, but as a name that needed to be pushed to the sidelines, so order could keep moving forward. Discussions quickly shifted, new faces took the spotlight, and Manny became a story of the past in the blink of an eye. For him, the pain wasn't just being banned from the league, it was how everything ended so abruptly, so coldly, as if an entire decades-long journey was reduced to a single disciplinary notice. No closing ceremony, no opportunity for him to stand before the crowd and say his own goodbye in his own way. Manny wasn't allowed to end the story as a real person, only as a record. And that created the climactic tragedy, not because the mistake went unpunished, but because a human being wasn't given the right to speak the final words. When the lights went out, Manny was no longer at the center of heated debates, but the mental cut remained, deeper and more smoldering. He carried the feeling that he had gone as far as he could, that any effort to explain now was pointless, and that silence, however painful, was still the least damaging choice. No final stage, no farewell applause, just a lingering emptiness where a genius walked away from the game he had once loved with all his instinct. MLB moved forward, as large systems always do, and Manny stayed behind, not because he wanted to, but because the door had closed without anyone looking back. In that silence, Manny's tragedy reached its peak, a brilliant career ending not in light, but in quiet darkness, where the cheers were gone, and only a man remained, facing the reality that his journey in the world's greatest league had closed without leaving any moment of farewell to hold on to. After the MLB lights went out, Manny Ramirez entered another phase of silence, a phase without cheers or noisy criticism, but one of quiet, prolonged, steady exclusion. It was the time when the Hall of Fame began calling the names of contemporaries, those who shared the field, those who faced Manny in fiery seasons, yet the name Manny Ramirez never appeared. His numbers remained, cold and immortal: 555 home runs, a .312 batting average, more than 1,800 RBI, 2 World Series championships, a World Series MVP, a career that, if separated from all controversy, would be enough to carve his name into American baseball history, without footnotes. But the Hall of Fame isn't just a place for numbers, it's a place of selection, and with every ballot that didn't include Manny, the story repeated itself in the quietest way. No official statement, no moral verdict read aloud, just the annual results announced where Manny continued to stand outside, as if his absence was obvious, and needed no explanation. The pain lay in the fact that Manny didn't campaign for himself, didn't run an image campaign, didn't appear frequently in the media to retell his story in the most favorable way. He didn't justify, didn't write open letters, didn't try to convince anyone that he deserved to be seen more fully than what the disciplinary record allowed. Manny accepted the rules in mute fashion, as if he was too tired to keep fighting in a space where his voice had never been properly heard. Each passing year, as the list of inductees was revealed, Manny watched another layer of history close without him in it, and that repetition created a spiritual tragedy hard to name, not a violent shock, but a systematic feeling of being forgotten, excluded without fanfare. To the public, Manny's absence gradually became familiar. To Manny it was a constant reminder that all the glory he once had wasn't enough to erase the cracks that had been deeply carved. The Hall of Fame, formally, is just a museum. Spiritually, it is the final recognition, the affirmation that the journey mattered beyond mistakes. When that door didn't open, Manny didn't react with public anger or bitterness. He simply stepped back further into silence, carrying the feeling that history had chosen to remember him through absence. The consecutive years of exclusion didn't create a climax, they eroded slowly, making hope, if it ever existed, fade over time. Manny didn't try to rewrite collective memory, didn't try to reclaim the right to tell his own story, and that very inaction made the tragedy deeper. Because in a culture where everything is promoted, where legacies are often built through constant presence, Manny chose to disappear, and that disappearance was understood as acceptance. But acceptance doesn't mean absence of pain. Behind the calm exterior was a man carrying a question that was never answered: were the things he gave enough to outweigh the things he did wrong? The Hall of Fame didn't answer that question, it simply repeated the silence each year, and in that void, Manny Ramirez continued to exist as a living paradox, a statistical legend without a place for his name, a man excluded not by condemnation, but by an absence so prolonged it became normal. After the big doors of MLB closed, and the Hall of Fame remained silent, Manny Ramirez stepped into a world where no one called his name with formality or noisy debate anymore, a world so ordinary it was heartbreaking for someone who was once an icon. Japan, then Taiwan, then Mexico, emerged as distant stops, not for new glory, but because they were the last places that still accepted his baseball heart, that refused to die. Smaller fields, sparser stands, softer lights, slower game rhythm, all created a scene completely opposite from the electric nights in Boston or Cleveland. Manny stepped onto the field to scattered applause, no more prolonged roars, no more pressure from next morning's headlines, but also no longer the feeling of belonging to a larger story. In those places he wasn't a legend honored by collective memory. He was a strange name to many young fans, an aging player carrying the faint reputation of the past. The swings were still there, sometimes flashing the old beauty, but they fell into empty space, where no shared history resonated. Manny once made all of MLB pause to watch. Now he walked among fields where people came out of curiosity more than reverence. The tragedy wasn't that he had to play in smaller leagues. It was the gap between memory and present, between the man who once stood at the peak and the quiet image of a man preparing his bat in front of a few thousand spectators. Manny didn't complain, didn't show bitterness. He accepted that reality with an almost weary calm, as if he were used to being placed outside official stories. In Japan, Taiwan, or Mexico, Manny found the quiet MLB never gave him, but it was the quiet of no longer being expected, no longer scrutinized, no longer remembered. He played for himself, for the familiar rhythm of the game, for the small comfort when bat met ball, not for fame or redemption. Each small field was a silent reminder that the world had moved on, and Manny was now just a fringe part of collective memory. To many it might have been a sad ending to a great career. To many it was the continuation of a life long accustomed to silence. He didn't try to return to the center, didn't try to turn the post-MLB years into an image-reclaiming campaign. He quietly lived in the new reality, where he was allowed to be himself without explanation. But that very calm carried a profound sadness. A man who was once a legend now existed as a nobody, traveling through foreign countries with a familiar bat, carrying memories of stadiums that once exploded for him. The world no longer called Manny's name, no longer debated him, no longer waited for him to appear, and in that forgetting, Manny kept walking, not to reclaim the lights, but to hold on to a part of himself that had been tied to baseball since his days of poverty. Manny's everyday tragedy lay there, not a loud collapse, but the slow fading of a once great name, while the man carrying that name continued to live, continued to accept that sometimes the most painful thing isn't being criticized, it's no longer being mentioned at all. When Manny Ramirez turned 53, he no longer lived to the rhythm of the season, no longer counted days by the schedule, no longer woke up with the feeling that the whole world was waiting for him to step onto the field. Manny's life now flows slowly, quietly, almost the complete opposite of the image that was tied to him for more than 2 decades. No more packed interviews, no more big headlines, no more endless debates about his legacy. Manny chose to step back, not as a statement, but as a natural reflex of a man too accustomed to being misunderstood. He doesn't resent MLB for closing the door, doesn't blame the media for framing him, doesn't demand fairness from history. Silence now is no longer a forced refuge, it's a conscious choice, a way to keep the cracks from being touched again. Manny exists in the small space of family, where he doesn't need to explain why he's quiet, doesn't need to prove he cares, doesn't need to be anyone's symbol. There, he's just a father, a husband, a man who once went very far, and now returns to the simplest things. That life isn't glamorous, isn't dramatic, but it carries a sad calm, as if each passing day is built on the acceptance that the past can't be fixed. Manny doesn't try to erase what happened, he carries it as an inseparable part of himself. The cracks formed from poverty, from immigration, from fame, from mistakes, and from how the world reacted to all of it. At 53, Manny understands that some doors will never open again, and standing in front of them knocking forever only adds more pain. Instead, he learns to live beside the closed doors, building a new life that doesn't need outside validation. He doesn't try to rewrite his story, doesn't join image rehabilitation campaigns, doesn't try to convince anyone he's changed or deserves to be seen differently. Manny accepts that history will remember him its own way, fair or not, and the only choice left is to live so the present days aren't swallowed by the past. The tragedy here is no longer loud, no longer climactic, it settles into a long smoldering sadness, tied to the feeling that one life can be both very great and very unfinished at the same time. Manny no longer stands in the middle of stadiums, but the memories of them still follow him in every movement, every small habit, like the way he holds a bat while showing his son how to hit, or the way his eyes linger longer when he hears the ball meet wood. A life carrying cracks doesn't mean a failed life. For Manny, it's a life lived to its fullest capacity, even if the price paid was greater than he ever imagined. At 53, Manny Ramirez isn't a legend honored in ceremonies, nor a cursed outcast. He's the man left standing after it all, quietly moving forward with family beside him, carrying both glory and pain as two inseparable sides of the same life. When the story closes, Manny Ramirez doesn't stand in one final glorious moment, doesn't walk onto the field under lights to receive tribute, isn't welcomed back by history as a complete legend. At the end of that journey, there's no clear redemption, no Hall of Fame, no ritual of forgiveness big enough to erase the cracks that ate deep into his life. Manny reaches the very end of his story, the same way he walked it from the beginning, quietly, enduring, and not demanding the world understand him more than it's willing to. Manny's tragedy isn't in failing, because he was never a failure in terms of performance. The tragedy is that he was never healed from the gap between the real person and the image the world pinned on him. Manny's numbers still stand as undeniable witnesses, but they stand alone, without the spiritual support, without a final reconciliation between the talent and how it was perceived. Manny wasn't redeemed by history, because history usually only accepts easy-to-tell stories, and Manny was too complex, too silent, too different to fit the familiar molds. He didn't receive full forgiveness, not because he wasn't wrong, but because the world never truly wanted to understand where that wrong came from, or how it formed in a man raised between poverty, immigration, pressure, and prolonged loneliness. But if you look deep enough, Manny wasn't destroyed. He survived a cold system, survived fame turned into surveillance, survived headlines that reduced his life to a joke, survived punishments that closed the biggest door of his life without giving him a chance to say goodbye. Manny gave baseball everything he had: pure talent, survival instinct, swings that changed the fate of games and his youth. He endured in silence, not from weakness, but because that was the only language he knew to survive. That silence didn't save him from judgment, but it kept him from breaking completely. At the end of the road, Manny doesn't stand as a victorious symbol. He stands as a man who went too far in a world that never learned to listen. No Hall of Fame doesn't mean he wasn't great. No full forgiveness doesn't mean he didn't deserve compassion. Manny is proof of a subtler tragedy than failure or downfall. The tragedy of being misunderstood for so long that no one remembers anymore that behind every label was once a man trying to live true to his instincts. When the story closes, the aftertaste isn't anger, isn't condemnation. It's a long, quiet sadness for a genius who was never healed. Manny Ramirez wasn't completely erased by history, but he also wasn't fully embraced by it. He stands in that in-between space, where glory and tragedy overlap, where one life was both brilliant and unfinished. And perhaps the only fair ending for Manny isn't judgment, but this belated acknowledgement: some men are not destroyed by failure. They are destroyed by being misunderstood for too long. The story of Manny Ramirez leaves a deep, lingering sadness, not because he lacked glory, but because he was never seen as a complete human being. From the early parts, when Manny was born into poverty in the Dominican Republic, when talent arrived before language, we clearly see a child learning to survive on instinct rather than words. When he immigrated to America, in Washington Heights, baseball became the only place he was accepted, while outside the field was prolonged alienation. This explains why throughout his MLB career, from Cleveland to Boston, Manny was always present but not belonging: silent clubhouses, tense relationships with coaches, and finally being framed by the phrase "Manny being Manny," a saying that stripped away context and turned a person into a punchline. The greatest tragedy wasn't the two PED positives, it was Manny's response: silence, no defense, no explanation. That silence let the public see only guilt, not a tired, lonely man lacking the tools to protect himself. When MLB closed the door without goodbye, when the Hall of Fame excluded him year after year despite immortal numbers, and when Manny had to wander through Japan, Taiwan, Mexico in front of sparse stands, we witnessed a legend quietly pushed to the edge. At 53, Manny lives quietly with family, without resentment, without demanding fairness, carrying cracks that will never heal. The lesson for America isn't just about sports, it's about society. A culture too quick to judge and too slow to understand can destroy a person not by failure, but by prolonged misunderstanding. Manny reminds us that talent needs to be protected with compassion, and that behind every public icon is always a human being who just wants to be heard. Thank you for staying until the end of Manny Ramirez's story. If you believe that silent geniuses also deserve to be heard and understood, please subscribe to the channel to keep joining us. See you in the next video, where we'll continue telling the tragic but deeply human stories behind sports legends.